Well, this book has had a long gestation in my life. I initially conceived it, an earlier form of it, as a potential television series that I pitched to TNT Network in the late 90s. And that didn't go anywhere. But I found that I just kept thinking about the world that I had proposed creating in that series, which was a world that was centered around two places, around two kinds of work. Guys who own a used record store in Oakland, California, and then their wives who are nurse midwives in practice together in Berkeley. The more, even as time went on and I did other projects along the way, I just kept thinking about those settings, and I live in Berkeley and I spend a lot of time in Oakland, and so the world that I had imagined building the world of that television program out of was always present for me, and so I could never quite stop thinking about it. And eventually I decided to try to reconceive it and think of it more as a book, and to be honest, I thought that was going to be this really easy process. Hey, I had already written this 90-minute pilot, so it was probably just going to be a question of novelizing it. It would be like a snap. It was already written. It actually turned out that was completely false. The opposite was true. It made it much harder to write because I had already conceived it in one form, and it took me a good 2 years to finally break and realize that it was not going to work like that, and I had to just start all over again, reconceive it completely from the ground up as a novel, and after that it was about another 3 years till I finished it. But altogether it was a 10-year process from the time I first thought of the proto version of it as a TV series to completing the book was a 10-year period, and I worked about 5 years on the book itself. I had a kind of an epiphany walking into a used record store near my home one day and seeing the way that it was this little pocket universe. This shop was staffed by a black guy and a white guy, and they were working together, and their clientele, who were all hanging out up at the front of the shop talking, were very mixed. And I grew up in a place, Columbia, Maryland, a town outside of Baltimore, Maryland, that was very integrated, and I had grown up in a world where black people and white people did everything together, and I had moved very far away from that in the course of my life. And when I walked into that record store, and it just, something struck me about it, and I recognized it, and it just felt like a world that I had been sort of looking for since leaving it as a child. And it was about things I really care about, like music and records generally. Vinyl records are of great interest to me personally, and so there was just something about it that seemed like the perfect setting both for storytelling and for me thematically. I was also at that point in my life, my wife and I have 4 children, and so we went through 4 births and 4 sets of midwives, and at that point I knew a lot about birth and birthing and midwifery, and it was a fascinating, incredibly powerful subject to me, something that did make me want to try to write about it, and somehow or other those things ended up getting tangled together in a way that I don't really quite understand. The record store is kind of like a bar. It's like a tavern, and taverns and bars have always been great sources of story. People are always coming in and out and telling their tales and going their way. So that was pretty clear to me. And then, birth stories and stories of birth and the narrative of a birth, each one is like a novel in itself, so it just felt like really fruitful. I have an office behind our house in Berkeley that I share with my wife, who's also a writer, Ayelet Waldman, and so it's a shared space. I use it at night, she uses it in the daytime, essentially, when things are flowing normally in our house. That's how it goes, because I work at night. And it's a good place to get work done, and I'm happy there, but I'm not really, I'm not that particular about where I work. As long as it's quiet and I can focus or concentrate, I can work anywhere. I work really well on airplanes. If I can put on my noise canceling headphones and have the right kind of music playing, I can really just drown out my immediate surroundings. I can work in doctors' offices. As long as I have a means of typing on me, it doesn't really matter to me. The main thing for me is to try to work every day and to try to hit a certain minimum. If I'm working on a novel, I really do try to get 1,000 words a day, every day. I work 5 days a week normally, sometimes 6 days a week, and just try to crank it out like that, because novels are big and they have a lot of words in them. I listen to music constantly while I'm working. I have certain old standbys that I just rely on that will just immediately drop me into the right frame of mind for work. I think of those, the one I probably listen to the most, and we're well into the several thousand times, is Music for 18 Musicians by Steve Reich, which is a fantastic piece of minimalist classical music from the 1970s that is just, it has everything that I need from a piece of music for working, which is that it's instrumental. I can't listen if there's singing or lyrics, that doesn't work for me. That it's propulsive, it's steady rhythmically, and the dynamics are even. It doesn't have like little quiet parts and then loud parts. That doesn't work for me either. The dynamics have to be pretty even. So that's the ideal piece. But every book I've worked on also has kind of a suite of music associated with it in my mind that I have listened to in many cases to kind of get me into the right frame of mind, the right mood, time period sometimes. So when I was working on The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, I listened to a lot of big band swing music, Glenn Miller and Benny Goodman and the Benny Goodman quartets. And we're working on this book, Telegraph Avenue. I did a lot of musical exploration, listening when not writing and also while writing, and then I did eventually kind of evolve this core playlist of works from the 1970s. There was kind of this very fruitful, relatively short-lived hybrid called soul jazz that flourished and later came to be called acid jazz, that flourished in the early to mid 70s, where really accomplished jazz musicians sort of adopted a much more steady, straight ahead rhythm and blues kind of rhythm section with drums and bass carrying a much more almost danceable rhythm, but the playing was just as free, and the spirit of improvisation of jazz was fully present, and yet it also had this kind of rhythmic steadiness, and it turned out to be a very conducive music for writing to me, and always got me into the frame of mind of these guys, Nat and Archie, who ended up perhaps inevitably specializing in that particular kind of music in their store. That's their thing, and they're in a band together that plays that in that style as well. So that soul jazz of the 70s kind of became the signature soundtrack of the book for me. I have to have a big glass of water with me while I work, and I continually get up and fill that glass of water. So there are also a lot of trips to the bathroom while I'm working. Caffeine, I drink a lot of coffee in the morning, but by the time I'm working, it's been a while since I've had coffee. My routine while I'm working involves refilling that water cup, but also I listen to records. I listen to vinyl while I work, and it's actually the perfect 20-minute. That 20-minute interval is exactly what occupational therapists recommend as a work period, that you get up from your computer and then take a stretch and flex your wrists and get up and move around and get the blood circulating. It's every 20 minutes is what they suggest. So a record, one side of a record, is the perfect interval. Well, I read constantly and steadily while I'm working on a book. I'm always the book generates a reading list very much as it generates a musical playlist. So either I'm reading for research, there's some subject I need to know more about, and so I pursue and I try to amass enough books and read those books, or else I'm facing some kind of creative problem, say a problem of point of view, which I'm having a hard time figuring out how to handle, and so I might seek out or try to recollect or get recommendations of other works of fiction where other writers have successfully or unsuccessfully handled the same kind of issue, the same kind of problem, say like a frame story or constantly shifting points of view or whatever it might be, just to get a sense of how else it might be done, how else it might be handled. And then there are writers whose work I just read to sort of charge up the battery, writers whose prose just makes me want to write. Michael Ondaatje is an example of that for me. Cormac McCarthy tends to be writers who really push language within their sentences and who construct sentences that tax the language heavily, and those are the ones that when I read them, for me, sort of just get the linguistic juices flowing. Vladimir Nabokov would be another example. I have a horrible internet addiction problem. I'm very frank about it, confessing that it's awful. I mean, I love the internet, and it has been beneficial to my work in countless ways and is on a daily basis. It has also been incredibly destructive, incredibly detrimental, and so many of those supposed benefits are really just rationalizations and excuses for time wasting. And so I have to be pretty, I either go away to a place where I don't have internet and can't get internet, although that's getting increasingly difficult, and now that your phone is this great little computer, it's almost impossible, or I use this app Freedom that shuts off all your internet and makes it just hard enough to get it all back again that it's effective and it works for me. But if I don't do that, I will waste time, and it's really awful. It's when my work is actually going well, when I'm flowing and I'm writing this great paragraph and then just totally rocking on it, that's when I have that impulse to check my email. It's totally crazy. It's not like when I'm really scratching my head or can't quite figure out what I'm doing. It's those times as well, but it's also when it's going well. It's a horrible habit, and when you shut it off, when you do cut it off, you experience that, you have that impulse. You'll feel like, oh, I'm just gonna go check this, or here, of course I need to look up and see whether Volkswagens, in 1972, if they still had, the chrome bumpers, or had they already moved to the rubber bumper at that point, because I can't possibly continue with this novel until I check that fact. And if you can't do it because you've turned off the internet, you have that like, you really want to badly, but then you move past it and you keep going. I can get as much done in an hour with no internet as I can in 4 with the connection turned on. It's ridiculous.